Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, today we're tackling a notoriously confusing distinction that traps so many economics students. We're looking at the classic structural showdown between a simple movement along a curve and a total shift of the curve itself. When supply drops, it's incredibly easy to mix up the mechanics, but by the end of this session, you're going to have this completely locked down.
Okay, let's dive into this. Because let's be real, it's incredibly frustrating when textbook definitions start muddying together in your brain like a bad smoothie, right? Both of these terms essentially mean there is less of a product hitting the market. But in economics, a contraction and a decrease describe two entirely different events driven by two entirely different forces. And we're going to put them head to head right now.
First up, let's look at the strict textbook definition of a contraction of supply. It is a situation when the quantity supplied of a commodity falls due solely to a fall in its own price, while all other external factors remain completely the same. I really want you to mentally highlight the phrase, its own price. In a contraction, the background environment is basically frozen in time. Literally, nothing about the business has changed except the price tag on the shelf.
Now contrast this immediately with our second concept. A decrease in supply refers to a situation when the amount supplied falls due to a change in external factors other than its own price, while the own price of the commodity remains flat. Think of this like a structural shock. The price hasn't budged at all, but something fundamentally shifted in the background to force suppliers to pull back. So, the absolutely crucial point here is the trigger. If you want to know which one you're dealing with, you just have to look at what pulled the trigger. A contraction is triggered purely by a fall in the commodity's own price. A decrease, that's triggered entirely by the environment, meaning a change in external factors. Let's just take a beat to absorb that. Contraction equals price drop. Decrease equals environment change. To make those external factors tangible, let's look at the exact textbook examples that would cause a decrease. Imagine the raw materials needed to build your product suddenly skyrocket in price. Well, that increase in input costs is a major trigger. Or maybe there's a rise in the prices of related commodities, meaning a producer might shift their factory to build something more profitable instead. These are the background variables that force a supplier to produce less, even when the price of their original product hasn't changed one bit. All right, let's bring this to the whiteboard to see the visual mechanics actually in action side by side. Notice the structural difference immediately. On the left, representing a contraction, we have a single unbroken curve. But on the right, representing a decrease, you can see structurally shifted curves. Let's break these down one by one. Notice just how simple the movement is during a contraction of supply. Visually trace that single line downward. When a fall in price from OP down to OP1 causes the quantity supplied to drop from OQ to OQ1, we get a simple downward movement from point A to point B. It happens entirely along the exact same supply curve. Literally, no new lines required. Now watch how a decrease in supply completely shifts the framework. We're starting at the exact same price, OP. The price hasn't fallen at all, but the quantity supplied still shrinks from OQ to OQ1. Why? Well, because of that structural shock in external fundamentals we talked about earlier. This is represented by a complete leftward shift of the entire supply curve from SS over to S1, S1. The curve has moved bodily from point A to point B, and this brings us to the ultimate rule of thumb from the text, which I like to call the price parameter rule. Price changed, you're moving along a single line. That's a contraction. Background variables changed, you have to draw a completely new line. That's a decrease. In fact, structurally, a decrease means that a higher price, like OP1, is now required just to motivate the supplier to provide the original quantity of OQ. So, I want to leave you with this final thought to really burn these visual mechanics into your brain. On your next exam, when a prompt tells you that supply has dropped, what's the very first thing you're going to look for? Will you trace the old line because the price tag fell, or will you draw a brand new one because the world changed? Mastering this distinction is absolutely the key to conquering supply and demand. Thanks so much for joining this explainer, and keep that rule of thumb handy.